Attention startup leaders. Are you strapped for time but hungry for strategic insights? Introducing Managed Chaos, your go-to podcast for navigating the startup world in less time than your morning commute. Join us as we share expert advice, real-world examples, and actionable strategies to help you scale your business, allocate resources effectively, and achieve visionary results. Tune into Managed Chaos and join a community of like-minded innovators on the path to entrepreneurial success.
In a data-driven world, all leaders know what data is. It's what allows founders to know their products and services have met a market need. It's what convinces investors to spend on their company. It's what you look at in order to know where to grow, invest, or take big risks. But are we using data right? How do we know our data is accurate? Where can we find the right kinds of data? Welcome to Managed Chaos Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Katrina Purcell.
And I'm Rachel Anderson.
And today we're talking data. So look, Rachel, we all know what data hypothetically is, but sometimes startups overlook the power of good data. So I think we should talk a little bit about this as the groundwork for a deeper discussion, which I'm sure we'll have a bit later.
Yeah, I agree. I know we've talked about this a little bit in other podcasts, but it's really one of the number one conversations I have when working with new clients. It's really around data and decision making. So I think this is a great place for us to start.
All right, so we're going to open the floor broadly then. What is data for?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. Okay, so I think the best way to use data is really for two things. It's either to learn or to take action. So data allows us to learn about our customers, our processes, our limitations. And for example, if we look at Google Analytics, which is a web service through Google that essentially can analyze your entire web presence and lots of other things. That's a very simplified version. But we can learn what topics or on what pages customers like to spend their time. And if we look at things like our project management tools, we can learn about how our prediction of team time or tasks translate into what we're actually able to accomplish. These things really can help us refine things like our customer journey or how a customer might navigate through the web experience. We could also learn about our teams and where they spend their time or where our processes need to be refined to provide extra support. So those are all ways that we can really use data to learn something that allows us to ultimately take action, but we're really in that learning and then absorbing phase. And then on the other hand, we really can use data to make decisions. This is where the old adage of knowledge is power really is quite true. There's so much available data in the world that using it to our advantage can really be a strategic move for leaders. So we can assume that based on our experience or knowledge, a customer might like this new product, this new webinar, this new campaign, or whatever that is. But we don't really know that for sure. We're just using our own professional experiences and best practices to make that determination. So when we want to make a decision, even if it's maybe a more complicated one, data can be the source of truth in some ways that allows us to answer the question of what should we actually do.
It's so funny. It's that whole cause and effect argument, right? Or the chicken or the egg.
Yes.
Was it effective because of this, or was the person already in a good point when they got to it and you don't know? So I think
absolutely.
It's so important to know what data you're looking at and what it's trying to tell you without a bias going in, which might lead us into our next question, which is what is the best way to actually use data?
Yeah, it really is a good segue for that question, because I was immediately going to be like, Katrina, we got to talk more about that. So I do want to warn that data has a dark side. And in the briefest ways to describe it, data can be manipulated. So that's something to be very cognizant of as a leader. But also an overabundance of data can also lead to sort of an analysis paralysis. So first of all, when you're looking at data as a whole entity or all the available data to you, I recommend that you do not go find the data, pull it together, and then make a conclusion. I think that is the, like I said, the quote unquote dark side of data. Instead, data is most effective when you have a hypothesis, sort of treating it like our our science experiments back in elementary school. Like, we have a hypothesis and we're using data to validate. Now, the hypothesis could be, we have a fork in the road and we have to choose which path is greater. Or it could be, I need to know if this thing that we want to do, whether it's launch a new product or launch a new campaign or whatever that choice is that we're about to make, has meaningful outcomes. Then go look in your data about, do customers ask for it? Are customers available there? Is there enough information for you to drive that decision more safely rather than just, yeah, I think that's what they want, or yeah, I think this would resonate. What do you think, in your world, kind of when you're thinking about data, there's so much to say.
That's one of my favorite might be the wrong word for it, conversations around sort of, well, I know that this is the case, and it's normally a gut feeling. And then, the team is sent out to figure out how to support this gut feeling, as opposed to a true hypothesis that you're trying to prove. And so it's so important to let the data sort of walk you to the conclusion, not, really having this strong opinion and then just looking for only the data insights or snippets that support what you're doing and throw out everything else as an outlier, or as, oh, they just didn't understand. The other challenge that I always have is around finding clean data, or understanding that just because you have data in multiple systems doesn't necessarily mean you actually have a full picture. And there's actually a significant amount of work and lift that often goes into making that data more meaningful. And so let's talk through a little bit about how to create that meaningful data from all of these disparate sources.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, there's whole people that create their life around interpreting data correctly. It's where data analysts came from. So this can be an incredibly far-reaching topic and a really complex, diverse conversation we could be having. So for brevity, for what I think about and how I kind of look at it, meaningful data is most importantly reliable data. And so you mentioned clean data, and that is extremely important because, just as you said, having someone who really understands how that data was pulled, how that data came together to begin with, what is the tables and the summaries that were created from the original data source, what are the exceptions to the data, like all these pieces that surround even sourcing the data can be important in the conversation you're having, and the view that you have of the summary of that data, whether it's your own summary or brought to you from someone else. And I think the idea of clean data is really important because, for example, my last name is generally pretty easy to spell, Anderson. There's not like a whole lot of variations here, although I have had some interesting spellings and it always baffles me. But there's other people with, much more complicated names perhaps. So we'll take Anderson as an example. Let's say I'm entered into a sales system or a spreadsheet or whatever that is as Anderson SON or Anderson SEN or Anderson SIN, heaven forbid. I don't know if I've ever seen that spelling, but I'm the same person, but now I'm giving 3 different data points into the system. And that can skew your results, especially if you're doing it in mass. I mean, if you think about the amount of cities that can get misspelled, or even I've worked with companies where the company name was constantly misspelled. So there's tons of ways for your data to become quote unquote dirty or not reliable, and making sure that you understand the sourcing and the conclusion, how that came to be, And then also having it be reliable, which I think is another good way to say clean, is one of the most important ways to make sure that your data is meaningful. What do you think? Because
It is.
I'm
So
sure there's other stuff.
it's so funny you mentioned that. So I undertook for one of my clients a master data management project, which was essentially,
Mm.
let's say for instance that General Motors was a client. So they were GM in one system, they were General Motors in another system. And so there was actually no correlation between multiple systems on who the actual customer was. And so as they started to look at their list of total number of customers, they learned they'd been reporting it incorrectly the entire time, right? And so
Wow.
needing to walk that back once we actually put master data and we said, okay, names are always going to go in this format, cities have to be this format and this many characters, states have to be this way.
Yeah.
And starting to understand sort of, sure, in the early days, we didn't have any controls in place because we were in the early days and we were just firefighting, but sometimes setting that stuff up early means that you can catch those types of problems. And we can understand that
Mhm.
GM and General Motors are the same. Any rational person understands that. But in your data, your systems are not going to link those two things together. And, what if you have, Great Mary's something, right? And so that there's a GM
Mhm.
and maybe that could have been it, right? So the system's not going to want to
Mhm.
tie those two things, even though as a human brain, we're going to say, well, wait, we want to tie these two things together. And so it's so important to understand, even in the early days, how important it is to have some rules and restrictions and requirements around how things get entered into systems, and just how much that will help you in the long run to make sure that your data is reliable and that you can trust it.
That is such a good example. Oh, gosh, that would be my living nightmare to sort them out. That's why I'm not a data analyst.
The problem and the problem was they had a lot of Fortune 500 clients where everybody has an acronym or some other way that you refer to it. Think about Google, who then became Alphabet, right? And so, you know, how do you
Historical data then, how do you turn that all over? Oh, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I feel like we've only scratched the surface. So I am sure we're going to have more data episodes coming your way. But hopefully, this episode of Managed Chaos podcast was helpful in starting to whet your appetite on what is data and what is clean versus dirty.
This was another informative episode of Managed Chaos, the podcast for startups. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting apps, as well as on Instagram and YouTube, where we are at Managed Chaos Podcast. For additional resources or to continue the conversation, you can find Katrina Purcell and Rachel Anderson on LinkedIn.